All right, looks like we're about at time, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Chinda Chun, and I'm with NACB, the Consultants Training Institute. Before we get started with the round evaluation rule today, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, to obtain CP credit, you must answer all the poll questions that pop up on your screen during today's webcast. If you are a subscriber to the round evaluation rule webcast, you will see the CP certificates in your account within 7 to 10 business days. If you have any questions during today's webcast, please feel free to use the Q&A option in Zoom as those will be. Okay, so with the Around the Valuation World, we strive to provide you with updates to the industry. We do have some different art publications that we often pull from. We can't present on all the articles, so I want to provide you with links where you can obtain some additional information if you want to do a little bit of research. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Mel and Alina, who are our editors for the show, who will get us started for today.
Thank you, Chinda. And we're gonna jump right in. We've got a great program today, starting off with Roberto Castro and Greg Caruso talking about the broker opinion of value. And then we will go on to the body of knowledge, which is Michael Gregory is just amazing at this. It's one of the most popular segments that we do. And then talk about AI and AI tools, what to be careful about with Stephen White and Rob Schlegel. And then we'll go to our judges, which is another one of our popular panels with Janae, Castell, and the esteemed judges that we have. And Michael Kaplan will be joining there. And then Michael Gregory will come back with industry headlines and interview Merril Hirsh about court-appointed neutrals and special masters. So with that, this first session, I want to introduce Greg Caruso, who actually was the editor and running of AVW for like years. So it's so good to have you back, my friend, and doing the things that you're doing. He's an author of a relatively recent book and everything. Welcome aboard, and I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you. If you could change pages. Roberto Castro set this up with me. He can't be here, so I'm just going to dive in. My background, in addition to AVW, I've been doing valuations for almost 25 years. As a formal valuator for at least 20. I predominantly do compliance work. I do ESOP, SBA, and estate and gift tax. While I don't live in a trailer, I copied from Rod Burkhart, living virtually. So I live at 2 different houses, so litigation could be tough. Why don't we flip to the next slide? And so today what we're going to discuss is we're going to understand what a broker's opinion of value is, when it might be appropriate, what are appropriate uses, and then maybe some other uses I've seen, and how does it compare to our more formal conclusions and calculations of value. So those are our objectives. Let's roll to the questions page. So we're going to start with what is a broker's opinion of value? And what I can tell you is that's kind of a good question. It's something in the eye of the beholder. It is usually prepared by a broker, not a valuator, but some brokers will hire valuators to do them. I'm going to mainly talk about for smaller business brokers, and what they typically do is what I call a flat spreadsheet. They cast out 3, if it's a larger business, 5 years income statements. They do add backs. They often do them wrong, but they do them. And then they come up with a cash flow. Again, with smaller businesses, usually sellers' discretionary earnings, but it can be EBITDA. And then they find a multiplier, either from rules of thumb, such as the Business Reference Guide. A lot of them will use deal stats, which is good because that's where we get our comparables from. They get 90 days free access for providing a comparable. And some use Peercomps and some of the other resources. Usually it's 100% interest. Rarely is the balance sheet factored in. Rarely any notes or explanation. And often, again, because this is a broker who's thinking about selling a business, they're very aggressive with their add backs. Now, I will say, when you get to larger businesses and larger transactions, a broker's opinion of value can use more complex methodologies. Often the firms, even though they call them a broker's opinion of value, they will hire a valuator and rely more on the income method and other methods. What I will say is when they use the income method, if it's really brokers, they will often use a multiplier for terminal value instead of Gordon's growth rate with long-term growth in them. So how does this differ from a calculation and a conclusion? It would be very rare that it resembles a conclusion of value. You know, that, first of all, there are not standards. It's what the broker decides the standards will be. There's no required components. Doesn't necessarily need to be impartial. In fact, my assumption, if I'm handed a broker's opinion of value, is it's as favorable as it can be to the seller or whoever prepared it without being fraudulent. There's no report or explanation. Again, usually it's a simple market methodology. And so it's entirely different from a conclusion. Now, it can be like a calculation. And I would say if you also do business brokerage, when you issue a broker's opinion of value, I always made clear that these were conclusions. The AICPA says if there's no valuation judgment, it's not. I don't really know how. I can't think of a multiplier without applying judgment because I've done this 20 plus years. So I always send the calculation disclaimer that if we'd done an opinion, we'd do more. I send, even if I have to send it in an email, if it's an oral conversation, I will send them the methodologies we used and the level of detail. If I did my add backs off a conversation, I put it in an email. Then nobody can tell me I didn't give people the notices because I don't want to get hung up on that. Let's see. As far as report writing and ethical constraints, I think I just mentioned the biggest one. The other one I would say is, again, if you're a valuator working with a broker or for a broker, and if you're in the deal and you're may get a cut of the commission, I believe that's a conflict. Disclosed conflicts are okay in a calculation, but you better disclose it. Again, be clear with what you're doing and the level you're doing it with, and don't pretend it's not a calculation. It may not be, but I would rather be safe than sorry. Let's see. Let's jump down. I kind of covered when a CVA can issue a report. Who owns the report? You know, we did a lot of them for free as a come on, and we kept the report. We just gave them the range or the number that we thought they were worth. We weren't giving away all our details for free. I believe that would be subject to a contract. If you have a contract, contracts can be oral. I don't recommend it for valuators. I assure you, I always have an engagement agreement. I would suggest you do too. How long is the opinion good for? My view is any opinion is good until things change. Obviously, when we're doing compliance work, often the regulator has time frames that they will allow it for. Who can rely on the report? Again, to me, it depends. It just depends. I don't know. Usually it's being done for internal planning, perhaps for handing out as part of a sales package. I can tell you, I would always review one with caution. They can be very helpful in doing a valuation if you're second in, but reconfirm everything. Finally, if an ESOP is being considered, is a broker's opinion a good starting point? What I would say is it can be. Some brokers do very good, very thorough broker's opinions of value. And if the broker does it, well, then in an ESOP, what's going to happen is a trustee will be hired, and the trustee represents the future shareholders. And the trustee is going to have to hire an independent valuator who is going to do an extremely detailed opinion. So there will be an opinion. A broker opinion of value can't begin to satisfy that because you need certifications. But some people will try to save a few bucks in the early planning. The one thing I will say is when I get handed these broker opinion of value, if it's a cash basis taxpayer, usually we have big accrual issues and everybody gets very upset. Things like I had a consultant who had a prepayment. He collected a year's fee in advance. When that needed to get adjusted to an accrual basis, people were pretty upset. And it was also proper valuation theory. So if you could go to the next slide. I think that covers what I was here to cover. Some additional resources, look at our standards, study our standards. I also always suggest looking, even if you're not a CPA, at the AICPA's one, because they're rule-based, so they make a better checklist sometimes to make sure you are in compliance, even with the NACVA ones, which are a little more vague. Some states have licensing issues for brokers. Again, that's a whole different issue. We have certifications. As far as the market for broker opinion of value, we are starting to see interest rate issues on some of the smaller businesses. Some of the multipliers don't work at 8.5%, 9%, and 10% interest. And it's supposed to be a financial transaction. So in smaller ones, particularly SBA, where it may be a buyer with limited resources, we are looking at that in doing our opinions, much less our broker opinion of values. Let's flip to the next page. And I would like to thank you. I also want to stress two things I should have said in the beginning. Number one, these are my opinions. I've done this 20 years. I've stayed out of trouble, but they're my opinions, not the NACVA's. And if you ever have any questions about this or anything else, you are always welcome to reach out to me. I truly love this stuff. And I thank you for having me, both the audience and the people who put this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. It's always amazing having you with us. So we appreciate your time and your knowledge. And there you have your first polling question. So you can respond to that now. We are going now to our next session, and we are going to have Mike Gregory. He's our correspondent that you all loved, and he's going to be interviewing Jim Turner. They are going to be talking about Peercomps. Anytime we need to look for comparables, we are always looking what's the best tool. So Mike Gregory is going to be discussing that with Jim. So Mike.
Thank you very much, Elena. And Jim, I'm very happy that you're here with us today. Jim wrote an article in the Value Examiner, November, December. Peercomps, one of the most reliable guideline company transaction databases. So I read that article. It's extremely well done. And I gave Jim a call. We had him on about a year ago with another one of the articles that he wrote for the Value Examiner. But Jim was a very capable and also a very nice guy. He's a CPA, a CVA. He's a member of the International Business Brokers Association. So he just talked about brokers. He's got a lot of insight on that too. He's the founder and president here of Turner Business Appraisers. He focuses on three broad categories: strategic consulting on business valuation, small business mergers and acquisitions, local government property tax audits, and he's located in the Charlotte area in North Carolina. and that's his website. That's a great picture of Jim. And I'm going to go to the next slide here and say, Jim, is there anything you want to add relative to your background?
Well, I'll just say this, Mike, that I want to thank everybody for letting me have this opportunity to speak today. I think the topic is going to be one that is very interesting to all the participants. It's very interesting to me because we've probably all heard throughout our careers the different reasons why the market approach has some limitations. And I'm going to offer you today why the market approach has some great opportunity and actually has a lot of strength. So I'm looking forward to that.
And Jim, why did you write this article?
Well, I wrote the article, Mike, because what I've noticed in going to court multiple times is that a lot of my colleagues don't utilize the market approach. A lot of times I will go into court and have an opposing side in court as well. And oftentimes the opposition, the legal counsel and their evaluator have not developed, haven't asked the evaluator, or the evaluator has not developed the market approach. A lot of times I'll see statements like, I searched the comparable databases, but I couldn't find market approach comparable cells, and they'll maybe write just a paragraph that kind of with the reasons why they could not utilize the market approach. And today, what we're going to talk about is why they could use the market approach if they would have known maybe about Peercomps, because it is going to, during our conversation, you're going to hear why it really alleviates all the pushback that we may hear in different settings, whether it be court or whether it be, as Greg was doing, I think he does, it looks like he does a lot of ESOPs. There can be a myriad of reasons why folks would want to use the market approach, including for compliance with the IRS. Michael, you have some history there, so I think that's another good audience to utilize the market approach for.
So you've said, what I heard you say is you can use this in many different applications. I know one of the things that happened ahead of time is we put out the agenda for this and someone contacted me and they said, well, wait a minute, on Peercomps, they don't tell you the date. Can you really use that for fair market value? What's your response to that?
Well, my response is that yes and no. So number one is that there is a date in Peercomps. It is the year that the transaction was consummated. So let's say you have a March 2024 valuation or a June 2023 valuation. What I do is I utilize the comparable cells through the end of the prior year, prior to the date of the valuation. So in a 2023 valuation, I would just use multiples that I found comparable cells through 22. I would not use any of 23 because as the astute person pointed out, they do not include the month and the day that the transaction occurred, but it does include the year. So I don't think, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that's not a limitation. Raymond Miles did a lot of research to show us why the age of the comparable cells is not a factor typically.
Your article too, Krugman in his book came through and commented the same kind of thing that you're going to say here in just a few moments. So there's a fair amount of documentation that's going to say the multiples remain about the same in a given industry. It's the cash flows that change. So what's the nature of the entities in Peercomps? What's that look like?
Well, the nature of the entities are that they are at fair market value. The SOP, which is called SOP 5010-7 version 1, is clear, and all the SOPs going back as far as I've been reading them, which has been more than a decade, have reiterated the same fair market value standard. So within Peercomps, you are not going to find a big range of comparable cells where you have some that maybe trade at half of 0.5 times EBITDA, and then others that traded for 150 times EBITDA, which is what you tend to find in the other comparable sales databases. You're going to find a very tight range of comparable sales. The multiples are going to be very tightly wrapped around the mean, which is going to be very useful for your analysis with statistics, which we'll see later, where you're looking at your mean, your median, your coefficient of variation, and some other statistical analysis that we'll discuss.
Okay, and as indicated here on the slide, this is a maximum loan, SBA of $5 million, and the government guarantees 75% of the loan. So we're talking about entities that have less than $100 million in revenue, and it's a lot of smaller entities here too. So the Peercomps database, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great segue into this. So the Peercomps database has been around as of the article, which was published, as you mentioned, at the end of 23. There were a little under 15,000 transactions. The time period was 98 through 2023. And the comprehensive medians actually were price EBITDA of 3.88, price to seller discretionary earnings of 2.79, and price to revenue of 0.64. And so the database has an extensive history. The curators are a valuation firm founded, and it is still the curator of the database. And so they do a great job of ensuring that the transactions are in the database accurately. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you can use Peercomps to help ensure that you're getting accurate multiples.
And then in terms of the standard operating procedure and business valuation, who is this applicable to and how might it be applied?
So this is applicable to businesses that are transacting in an SBA loan. It's usually called the 7A product. And it's going to be for business transactions that will end in a goodwill or intangible value of greater than $250,000. That is in the SOP. So any transaction that is going to be financed using an SBA 7A government guaranteed product by any lender, which includes all your banks that you can think of, your favorite bank. And also it's going to be any transaction where there's a close relationship between buyer and seller. It doesn't just have to be nepotism or family relationship. It can also be close management also qualifies. So all those types of parameters are going to trigger the need for evaluation by an independent third party. The lender is required in the SOP to verify financials and IRS transcripts. The IRS transcripts, of course, T4506. And then the independent valuation has to be done by a qualified source. And this is one of the few places that I've ever found, Mike, in the literature, whether it be the Internal Revenue Code or anywhere else, that actually identifies what a qualified source is. And it mentions CBA, ASA, ABV. There is also something called a BCA. I didn't put it on here. I'm familiar with a BCA. There aren't a lot of BCAs, but for those of you that might be a BCA in the audience, you're also a qualified source. You have to be independent of the loan, which means no conflicts as well. In other words, you cannot be part of the underwriting team. So you have to be at arm's length away from the lender.
Okay, and then let's talk about consistent and comparable sales and adjustments of what kind of adjustments you might have to make.
Well, if we look at the Peercomps multiples, so what is included in a Peercomps multiple? Let's just say we're looking at a batch of comparable sales of CPA firms, and we find that the median is 4 times EBITDA. What that includes is in the Peercomps database is that those entities, let's say we found 25 CPA firms in 2023 that sold for 4 times EBITDA as a median. That 4 times EBITDA was what the buyer paid for inventory, machinery and equipment, and the intangibles. If the deal included cash, receivables, or other assets, then it would be it would reduce the market value of invested capital, so that every transaction is going to be presented in this manner of only including inventory, machinery and equipment, and intangibles. So it eliminates that task that we often find perhaps in other transaction databases, where we may have to go through and scour the comparable cells to decide, does this comparable cell actually exclude real estate, or was it actually accidentally slipped in there and presented in the multiple? Peercomps does all this for you, so that you get an asset structured multiple, which would typically only include no cash, no receivables, but the buyer usually buys inventory, they buy furniture, fixtures, and equipment, and they also buy all the intangibles. They assume no liabilities in the typical asset structure, and that's whether it's an equity purchase or an asset purchase. If you structure it in the typical asset means, you're going to come up with that, with those assets being sold and no liabilities being assumed. A liability assumed would increase the purchase price.
And in terms of application of the database, you want to talk a little bit about that here with an example?
Sure. We did an example in the article. I invite folks to go back to the article and look at that again, December 2023. Transactions were from the investment advice, or think about CFPs, certified financial planners, stock brokerage firms, that space. Sells between 200,000 and 7.5 million. Data range 2016 through 2021. This was a 2020 rather. This was a 21 valuation. So as I mentioned earlier, I would not include 21 because I don't know the month of the transactions in 21. 11 transactions met the criteria, and you can see the median 3.6, the mean 3.65. That's usually a good sign. If your median and your mean are close to each other, it's usually going to mean that your coefficient of variation is very close as well.
So then let's talk a little bit about some additional statistical analysis on what you have in your article.
I'd love to. So we've got the standard deviation of 0.64 and for price EBITDA, and price revenue is 0.58. I will say standard deviation is not typically the metric we stop with. It is going to compare one set of data, or one you can look at maybe the 11 transactions and look at each one of them standard deviation. But when you want to compare like price EBITDA with price revenue to see if the relative change in value, you're going to want to rely on coefficient of variation, which gives us which allows us to compare groups of a population. So if we want to compare price EBITDA, we would take the standard deviation divided by the mean, and we would come up with in this case, a price EBITDA coefficient of variation of 18.18, which is 18%. Coefficient of variation for price revenue, 0.37. So even though our standard deviation was higher for price EBITDA, it was the coefficient of variation, or the variation from the mean of the price EBITDA was a lot closer to the mean. The average transaction was only 18% away from the mean, versus in the price revenue, the average observation was 37% from the mean. So
in this case, you'd give greater weight to price over EBITDA because it has such a low number on the coefficient of variation for a price over EBITDA.
Yes, absolutely. And we tend to find that the coefficient of variation for price EBITDA and price SDE in the Peercomps database tends to be lower than 0.25, and often it's lower than 0.20. And if you read the literature, published by statisticians, they'll often tell you that a CV below 0.3, especially 0.2, you know, you're really getting into a tight range around your mean. And I will say this, the other databases tend not to have a very low coefficient of variation. So just to throw that out.
Yep, it helps they've got this nice grouping and those ratios remain pretty much the same. And then I'm just going to comment, you've got detail on this in your report, but I just put this in as there's a description of each of the entities, who the actual bank is that did this, the NAICS code, the state you're in, the sales price, the year and the revenue, and then you've computed EBITDA and price to revenue and price to EBITDA. And then you've got your median, mean, standard deviation, and coefficient of variance down below those. So that's what you put in your table. And is that typically what you put in your report too, or do you put that in your report?
I put all this in my report, and actually the EBITDA and price revenue EBITDA, all these fields actually are in the come with Peercomps. So you do get EBITDA, you get price revenue, and you get price EBITDA.
Okay.
What you don't get is I just calculated the standard deviation here. But you get the mean, you get the median, you get the coefficient of variation. I did calculate the standard deviation just to show the audience in our example there what the standard deviation was in this example.
Okay. And then in terms of an equity conversion, what's involved with that?
Well, if you've got an equity transaction and you truly have cash and receivables that are involved in the transaction that it conveyed, and you have some maybe liabilities that were assumed by the buyer, then what you do is you simply take the appropriate multiple, let's say 4 in our CPA example, and let's assume that the CPA example included $500,000 worth of cash and receivables. And so if we multiply EBITDA 500, let's say it's $1 million EBITDA times 4, we'd get a $4 million value, but it also included $500,000 worth of cash and receivables. So an equity value would be the $4 million for those assets that are included in the multiple, which would be the inventory, the furniture, fixtures, and equipment and intangibles. Plus, we would add in the $500,000 in receivables and cash. Now, if we assumed any liabilities, then that would decrease the market value of invested capital. So, but if it's $4.5 million in my example I just gave, where we have $500,000 worth of cash and receivables and a 4 multiple on $1 million EBITDA, let's just say that there was $1 million worth of liabilities assumed, then now we're down to a $3.5 million equity value.
So in terms of your conclusion of using the Peercomps, what would you say about this?
Reliable, reliable, reliable. It's unbelievably reliable, does not include distressed cells for the most part. No database is going to be perfect, but this is about as close as I've seen. And I've used a number of other transaction data and still use a number of other transaction databases. I think it's important to have several options. Does not include investment transactions. I have spoken, we do SBA business valuations for a number of lenders. And when I see, a synergistic buyer purchasing a business and we're doing an SBA valuation, we'll reach out to the lender and just say, hey, the broker included some synergistic investment standard add backs. Do you want us to consider this? And the lenders tell me, no, do not include investment level add backs, because the SBA program was never designed, the 7A program and other SBA programs were not designed for me to go in and increase my portfolio of investments. And so it's really designed for, folks who are in a fair market transaction. Now, it doesn't preclude someone who owns a business to buy another business using an SBA 7A product, but you just can't use investment standard add backs or normalizing adjustments, as we would call it. The curator adjusts the multiples to market value of invested capital for inventory, equipment, intangibles, and no liabilities. Again, that is a huge step forward, I think, that we can rely upon this database and this curator to do that for us. Most of the transactions that we see are already asset based in this fashion. So there are very few comparable sales that the curator actually has to adjust, but they do adjust those.
In terms of limitations, you mentioned some of these things earlier, but just run through what some of these are.
Well, loans are limited to $5 million. It doesn't mean the transaction can't be more than that, but that's all that the SBA will allow for a loan to be. So if you have seller financing, it could be a $10 million, it could be a $20 million transaction. Upper limits on EBITDA, when I look at the global population and Peercomps of all the comparable sales, it seems to be $10 million in EBITDA is an upper limit. Revenues don't tend to be over 100 million. And you can see the cost there if you wanted to go check that out. I will say this, I'm not paid by Peercomps. I only did this because I was very frustrated going to court and having opposing counsel and other valuators not develop the market approach. So I do know the guys that own this database, but we're actually competitors. I'm not receiving anything other than the fact that I'm getting information out here to the community.
Yeah, I know I'm asked to critique anywhere from 2 to 4 reports in a given month from different valuers. And for smaller entities, historically, what they've done is said, I can't find any comparables for the smaller entity. This allows you to have some comparables and do some analysis with market data for smaller entities. So do you have an overall conclusion or any other observations you want to share about the database and what you have here in your article, or just your observations with your work in this area?
Well, the overall conclusion, I'll say it again, is the reliability is very accurate. We tend to find consistency among the comparable sales, whether you're pulling a comparable sales for a CPA firm, a manufacturing firm in plastic injection molding, or a company involved in IT, or whatever the industry is. The multiples tend to consistently have low coefficients of variation. And the other thing I would say is some other observations is that I would like to share with the audience that in the article I talk about some of the research that Raymond Miles had done years ago. He was a pioneer in business valuation. He created the Institute of Business Appraisers. That was he developed that. He also helped curate the Business Brokers of Florida's database of comparable sales. And so Raymond did a lot of research statistically, and he was an engineer by trade. So to just kind of give you the level of how intuitive this man was and how thorough he was with statistics. He did a lot of studies. I have access and I have those studies. I've read them. He has proven that the age of the comparable sales are not, they don't change over time significantly.
Multiples remain very similar.
Yeah, they remain very similar. And also, there doesn't seem to be any geographic issue. That's another pushback that you may hear in litigation as well. How many sales were in? I live in the Charlotte, North Carolina. How many of these were in Charlotte, North Carolina? And we have to say 0, but it's not like real estate in the fact that if you've got $1 million in EBITDA and you can make that money, let's say it's an absentee owner, then do you care whether it's in Charlotte or Roanoke, Virginia, or Atlanta? That's not what drives the hypothetical buyer's decision-making process. If it's a truly absentee, the $1 million is going to go in their pocket no matter where they're at. So it's not location, location, location with valuation. It tends to be cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. And so that's something that Raymond Miles and Jack with the Jack Sanders with Peercomps has also, or BizComps rather, has written articles. And then Gary Trugman has, as you mentioned earlier, Michael has quoted, and he has his own thoughts in one of his books.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. This is Jim's contact information, email, his phone number. There's his website. Jim, thank you very much for one, writing the article, and two, being on with Around the Valuation World today. This was very informative, and hopefully other folks will also take a lot away from this today too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jim. And with that, our next polling question is up, and we're going to move to our next segment with Stephen White. And he's going to be interviewing and having a conversation with Rob Schlegel. Hopefully I pronounced it correctly. Talking about automated valuation models and AI tools and what we need to be careful about. I'm fascinated with this whole topic, so I can't wait to have us go into this. Stephen, you on?
I guess I've been so excited about this I forgot to turn on my camera and my microphone here.
Oh, there you go. There you go. It goes better with the camera and the mic on, man.
But this is going to be a great topic. And it's a session that we're doing later on this afternoon as well.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, I'll let you take it away and introduce your guest, and let's have some fun.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mel. Rob, I see you there.
I think I'm still here.
Yep, you are still here. Well, thank you so much for taking time out to be a part of this show for us this afternoon. I know that you're going to be presenting on this topic, AVM and AI tools. Be careful later on this afternoon. But for those of you who are not familiar with Rob is the principal with Houlihan Valuation Advisors, a national valuation firm. His professional background includes extensive work in business appraisal, marital dissolution, partnership dissolutions, estate planning, market studies. Yes.
Stephen, don't read all that stuff.
Well, it's important because I'm tying this into something. So
I'm
bear
just
with me just for 1 second. You're more than just evaluator, because more importantly, you also were the president of the Indiana chapter of the American Society of Appraisers. But all of that ties into one thing that is extremely important that I never forget to mention, is that you also served our country over a certain period of time. So I do thank you for your time and your service that you were able to provide for our country. So it does make sense. And I do take pride in taking time to share the information about all the accolades that you actually have. But we are going to dive into the valuation space of what you do and what you're going to be sharing with everyone later on today. And what I decided to do is just take a couple of things from your topic that you're going to be going over today, and just you and I just have a great conversation about them. And it ties right into these three areas: understanding the pace of technology, about AVMs and the NACVA tools that we actually have, and then what is AI. And you and I had this conversation before, and I think it's fascinating. I think AI is one of those areas where you either know a lot about it or you're still scratching the surface trying to figure it out. What does it all mean to us? So maybe you can kind of give us a little overview from your experience. Exactly what is AI?
We can talk about AI, but Stephen, one of the things I hope we can do when we have this hour-long presentation with, 30 plus slides, is give everybody a sense of perspective.
Mm-hmm.
We hear a lot of AI hoopla these days, fourth generation technology, take over the world, use AI, increase value, that kind of stuff. I think there's no question, but as you look ahead in the work that we all do as valuers, appraisers, whatever term you use, the use of technology in not only automated valuation models, and I'm going to talk about that. And by the way, ValueSource Pro, that is NACPA sponsored in some ways, is one of the best ones out there, but it can't be misused. But more on AI and what's some of the things we see in AI, not only affecting what we do, but more importantly, affecting what our client companies are going to do. will AI lead to increased productivity, increased levels of earnings, increased levels of growth, give the company a sustained competitive advantage? These are the things that I really want to touch on, because I don't want everybody to get misguided in terms of the hoopla that's out there.
And there is a lot of hoopla out there.
There is.
There is.
One other thing I think I should add. Yeah, I'm one of these old characters that have been around business valuation for apparently a long time. You have that in my bio where it says went to work for Burroughs Corporation in the 1960s. You know, I came up through punch cards, and that makes me very old. But more importantly, I started into valuation in the late 80s. Prior to that, I led consulting practices for Price Waterhouse on computing. And before that, I was an academic teaching this stuff in my doctoral program. So I'm trying to provide a perspective and a sense of proportion as well in terms of what does all this stuff mean? How can we use it? What are the things that AI, for example, may affect different industries? Got a couple of slides in there. Some stuff on affecting different functions, things like that that we have to think about.
Like I mentioned, this is a fascinating topic. And it's not just from a valuation perspective. I think it's a topic that is discussed in the legal area and the accounting, and you touched on what our companies will do. And if you don't mind, you want to touch on that a little more, because obviously that's something that we do. We do site visits, or at least we should all be doing site visits with our companies. Right. What are your thoughts, or what are you seeing as it pertains to how companies are utilizing AI, and how does that impact us?
Well, there's two issues. How it would impact what we do, as well as how are the companies using AI? Which one do you want to go into?
Well, let's touch on how companies are using AI first, and then we'll dovetail into the back part.
It will vary according to industry. It will also vary according to strategy. Go back to your Porter theory. If you compete on cost and you're just making widgets, for example, and you're not employing some of the new technology, sooner or later, this company's going to go into oblivion. If you compete on some form of focus or concentration or specialization or things like this, AI would assist, but it's probably less impactful than if you have a company competing on cost in the marketplace. So strategy of your client company is going to be one of the focuses. Now, in terms of utilizing AI, everybody talks about impact on marketing and sales and, you know, use of spreadsheet models and stuff like this.
Right.
Robotics in manufacturing. I jotted down something to talk about. I know in California, and you're not in California, are you, Stephen?
No, I'm in New Jersey.
All right. Well, that's too bad.
We have earthquakes here too, so we're not too different than California.
Yeah, but you know, in California, I know that just a couple of weeks ago, the state raised the minimum wage to $20, which is okay. But also, you'll see that there was an article and some video of burger restaurants employing more robots. So what you're going to see, places where you have increased pressure on the productivity of the worker, you're going to see more and more AI-sponsored robotics. And so for those of you who live in California, you may get a robot burger sooner or later. And maybe some person that says, you know, put in your money and say, that's what you want, and slide, here you go. There's that kind of input, because the influence of technology, broadly speaking, is what shapes a lot of the different industries that we have. Will it affect what we do? Absolutely. Will it affect other service industries? Yeah, that too, because of the increased efficiency and some of the reliability, some of the things that you're going to see in tools. Go back. I've got a couple of slides in there going back in terms of technology, back to ENIAC, and some of those things. Spreadsheets. You know, how many of us grew up with VisiCalc and Lotus 1, 2, 3, and finally Excel?
Mm-hmm.
The spreadsheets and the impact of word processing together are what allowed a lot of the automated valuation models, and there are many of them out there. My point here is be careful because they can be misused. Same thing for AI.
Mm-hmm.
You can misuse AI. You can buy all the hoopla that you want, but does it have an impact on growth, on cash flow, on competitive advantage? These are the things, you know, you mentioned visiting the business. I'm a big
Right.
one for understanding what I call the soul of the business. Article in BVR a couple of years ago.
Wait a minute.
Uh,
You call it what? I'm sorry.
The soul of the business. You'll probably like that,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So the soul of the business, we have to understand that. And that's what a buyer would do. A buyer isn't going to just do a bunch of spreadsheet analysis and dump it into some kind of a report with some AI modifiers. Buyer is going to actually kick the tires. Buyer is going to look in terms of the management strength, the other things, and there's no AI program that I know of that will give us the sense of judgment, of spontaneity, of proportion that you see by really understanding the business.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So
Yeah, I agree with you as far as and going back to understanding more about the overall company and how important it is for evaluators to really engage with management of understanding how they are utilizing those tools. And that should be a question that is asked as you're going through your due diligence of understanding. Walk us through how you're actually utilizing AI, if you're using AI, and if they are, how are you utilizing it? And I find that that's not a question that probably rolls off a lot of people's tongues to start inquiring about that because they're not equipped to. Go ahead.
I would use the phrase, how does the company employ technology?
Mm-hmm.
That will lead you into how they make products, where they rely on human resources, where they, you know, risk wages, things like this. Understand the direction of the company. And if the company is not using these technological tools, but like I say, they're in a cost competitive market, sooner or later, they're going to hit a brick wall.
And to your knowledge right now, what percentage would you say, or what industry would you believe utilizes AI the most?
Ooh, I'd like to say manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a whole laundry list. As a matter of fact, let me turn to one of my slides. I actually asked ChatGPT
Okay.
which industries are going to be affected the most, and they came up with retail, e-commerce, transportation, and healthcare. Healthcare, obviously, because you're going to have a lot of other impact on, I'll just say, a wide variety of data and
Mm-hmm.
allocation of symptoms and things like this. But retail and e-commerce, you know, we go onto Amazon these days and we say, I want this, click on the cell phone, it's delivered the next day, and we get a 500-inch hole in our credit card later on.
That's true. What about finance?
Oh, sure. Finance in terms of the understanding of not only the integrity of the numbers, but also the comparability of the numbers. Now, you know, statistics is something where AI will help you look for patterns and anomalies in data. Go back to your auditing. I mean, how many of us did a stratified random sample? Well, okay. Now we got all the data. We'll use an AI tool to look for the anomalies and the patterns and see if there's anything that sticks out. So you have that influence.
So when the segment right before ours, and he was going over the market comps and things of that nature, I was thinking about AI and how all of that could actually tie in. But then it's also to your last bullet point that you have here, will AI replace CPAs and valuators? There's also that human element
Yes.
that we have to, and I know that you're going to go over this in detail during your segment later on this afternoon, but just kind of give us your thoughts as far as, and actually, I do have a slide here that I really liked, and I'll pull this up. This one I enjoyed, the evolution of the AI. It walks you through understanding what is AI, the machine learning, the deep learning, and generative AI, which I think is fantastic. So when you go over this, those who are going to be a part of the session, you'll truly enjoy this. But this one, because you talked about where you were as far as your teaching and moving forward with this, right? I've not going back to the 40s, but I do remember when the robo investor came into play, and it was supposed to really make investment bankers and wealth managers more obsolete, and everyone was going to utilize those tools. But one of the things that was so interesting is that the tool is still being used, but they still need that human element to make sure that they customize it more so to their overall client. But I thought this slide is extremely fascinating as far as looking at the beginnings of AI.
Well, yeah, again, when I was teaching at Case Western, doctoral work, late 70s, AI was a topic of discussion. Was it meaningful with a bunch of punch cards and stuff like that? Not really. But it has evolved over the years into what we call the large language models. And really in the last 10, 15 years has this thing started to take hold. AI is basically machine learning. And that concept and how it's employed is the one that we have to come to grips with. Again, my basic tenet is, yeah, we got to understand how this might affect what we do, but it's also going to affect our clients. And it's our duty to understand how the client is using technology with regard to their strategy, with regard to their levels of cash flow, with regard to their growth. These kinds of things are important.
So as we get ready to wrap up our session here, and again, your program is going to be running later on this afternoon here. What would you like to share about this particular session that we just didn't get an opportunity to touch on that you will do a deeper dive into later on this afternoon?
Well, we touched on a large variety of stuff.
Right.
I just hope that, Mel, if you're still there, I don't put you to sleep. You know, a couple of people asked me before, what the devil is an FASA? Stands for fossilized. But the thing we're going to do, hopefully, is allow Stephen, you as a listener, to walk away with a better understanding of what you have to think about. You can use AVMs and AI in what we do. Great tools. There is some potential for misuse. More importantly, think about some of this emerging technology and how it's going to affect our client base. That's what I want you to do.
All right. That is fair enough. Well, Rob, thank you so much for this time. Again, I think this is a fascinating area. There's a lot to really unravel, and I'm pretty sure, I don't know if you're going to allow the audience to ask questions during this time period, because there should be a lot of questions that can be asked as far as understanding what amount of this information should we utilize in our overall valuation as a whole, and also incorporating the right tools that we actually have to make sure that we're doing this the correct way, because you can fall into a very dangerous area. There was one point that you and I talked about as far as the legal area, where a lot of courts a few years ago, I think this was probably pre-pandemic, really didn't embrace attorneys utilizing AI in their reports. I'm not sure exactly where they are right now, but as far as valuators, I know some of us are actually utilizing AI. And I think that can be a slippery slope if you're not utilizing it the right way.
I've got some examples in there. What the attorneys are going to do on our cross-X using AI.
Wow. Okay. All right. So this is perfect then. It is definitely perfect. Well, thank you very much. Jenna, I think I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you have some things that you would like to go over with the audience pertaining to this session.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just pull up my screen real quick.
I'll stop.
I got it. Yeah, just as I mentioned, we do have the AVW in-depth webinar. Rob will go into more depth regarding this topic. It's later today. Um, there's a registration link in your materials. If you wish to join us for that, since you are joining us on AVW today, you are eligible for a 20% discount. So use the promo code AVW in-depth 20. It's shown below when you register, and you'll get that discount. While I'm on, I just wanted to also mention that we do have our 2024 Business Valuation and Financial Litigation Super Conference. It's going to be on December 12th and 13th with the recertification day on December 11th. We do have a tax day special, and I'm going to actually show a real quick video on that. All right, thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Alina, who will get us started with the next one.
Thank you, Shanda. Right now, we have one of our segments, the favorite segments that we have with our judges. And today we have Janae Castell with us. She's going to be talking with the judges about tips to avoid an engagement letter breakdown. So, Janae, you can take it from here. You're muted.
There we go. Thank you, Lena. Thank you, judges, for being present. Thank you, Michael, for putting us all together. I love hosting this segment with you guys and all the great information and wisdom that you bring to us. So we've got Judges Platt and Judges Driscoll with us. Judge Yates could not make it today. But I wanted to talk with you guys about engagement letters and being expert witnesses. When I'm in litigation, at least, I'm oftentimes one of or the only person in the room without either a law degree or without somebody representing me who has a law degree. So I believe other financial expert witnesses feel themselves to be sometimes in precarious situations or feel exposed to potential problems. And we rely on the engagement letter to kind of, one, protect us. And they can also serve another function in addition to risk mitigation. And that is a function of setting expectations with retaining counsel. So I wanted to explore with you what language may be found in expert witness engagement letters that an expert witness thinks will protect him, but is ultimately useless or unenforceable or just nonsense. What language might be there that could actually land an expert witness in hot water. So with that perspective in mind, I'd like you to think about and help us understand any one of a number of issues. So with respect to risk mitigation, what risks can be mitigated with an engagement letter? What risks essentially cannot be mitigated through an engagement letter? And with respect to the function of engagement letters and helping set boundaries or expectations with and for retaining counsel, what are the main factors that you think attorneys need spelled out for them by an expert witness?
So thank you for that great lead in, Janae, and I'm so pleased to be with Judge Platt today, and pleased to be with you on tax day. And I say that because on tax day, so many of you are CPAs by trade, and you may have been in public accounting at the outset of your careers. And so you all were probably very popular at cocktail parties in late March, mid-April, early April, perhaps to friends who didn't file their taxes in time, maybe late April, May, June, right? Lawyers can be popular all of the time to answer these very questions. So Judge Platt and I will we won't even, I don't even know if we do a shallow dive into the very questions you're asking. And the medium dive comes from really engaging with lawyers. You can't engage with judges on this because we can't give legal advice, but to continue to engage with lawyers on this very question. So if you don't have a good friend who's a lawyer, get a good friend who's a lawyer, where you can have this conversation and these really drill down questions on, well, I have this clause in my contract, or I have this clause in my retainer agreement. But let me get back to 30,000 feet. And that is, your retainer agreement is a contract. So for us as judges, and for the lawyers that present this contract to you, that's our bread and butter. That's what we learned first year of law school. And that also is, in the case of Judge Platt, who now is retired from the bench doing mediation, just about his full employment act is contracts and the lack of clarity in contracts. So I come back to 30,000 feet and I say, every word matters in your retainer agreement. Every word matters to create expectations for when things are good. And every word matters for expectations when things go bad. So don't get your retainer agreement off of the internet. Have that lawyer who's a friend look at your retainer agreement, perhaps barter your own financial wizardry in exchange for them looking at your agreement, because what you agree to, the words that you agree to, are going to be enforced by the court unless that agreement is the product of overreaching or duress or fraud, or unless the elements of that agreement are against public policy. You know, if you had in your retainer agreement, yeah, and I'm indemnified if I kill the judge in the middle of trial. Now, you're not going to do that, but if you have that in your retainer agreement, that's against public policy. Nobody's ever enforcing that, right? But short of that, the nuances that are in that agreement, again, as long as the process was not untoward, are going to be enforced. So take the time to dot the I's and cross the T's, and have someone who is a professional I dotter and T crosser to look at those words. I'm sorry for the long answer, but I just wanted to share those global thoughts, Janae.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Oh, Judge Platt.
Judge Platt, you're muted. Muted. Excuse me. Judge Platt, you're still muted, I think. You're still muted.
There we go.
Get a lawyer who's not muted. But I couldn't agree more. And the reason, when I was looking at potential questions, that right away, we as judges don't see these agreements unless there's a problem. If they're, and it's arguable whether they're discoverable in the case, it's the underlying case. Where we'd see it is if it got into an argument with you as an expert and the person who hired you. And by the way, person who hired you, it may not be as clear as you might think. If you were hired by, in a case involving an insurance company, the lawyer who represents the defendant, not the insurance company, theoretically represents the defendant, not the insurance company, but he got picked and hired and ultimately paid by the insurance company, which meant you got hired by the lawyer for the client, and the client and his or her principal is the insurance company, because that's who hires him and that's who will hire him again.
Mm-hmm.
You want that lawyer that's the friend of yours to be aware of that. You want them, and as Judge Driscoll said, every word counts. And you're creating expectations by your language. As is true in so many cases, people sign, they form LLCs, they form partnerships, they form corporations, and then they, as an afterthought, include a dispute resolution clause, which is usually pulled off the internet, notwithstanding that it was done in a law office, because that's not what their expertise is. And I have actually spoken to the point where I've said, you transactional lawyers who draft these agreements, whether it's for an expert or a lawyer, you might want to go down the hall and talk to the litigators and see if they can stand what you've just written, okay, and operate accordingly. But we're not going to see it unless you get into litigation with the person who hired you. Or occasionally some idiot will sue the expert on the other side for having an opinion that was contrary to them, which is, of course, what they were hired for. You don't want anything in your retainer agreement that suggests that the arrangements for your employment are governed by the opinion you have.
Mm-hmm.
That is fertile ground for cross-examination and very effective cross-examination. It also sets you up to be blamed if there's a problem. Another fundamental principle that they don't teach in law school is when a lawyer has to choose between blaming him or herself for the loss of a case or blaming the expert, they will almost always, if not 100% of the time, choose to blame the expert. That's a liability issue and certainly a risk. You want to eliminate language that suggests, not suggests, but says, you're not responsible for the result of your opinion.
Yeah.
But again, go get a friendly lawyer who's going to spend the time to look at and take seriously what you are asking them to do. Also, guard against mission creep. What are you being hired to do? Are you being offered as a consult? Are you being hired to consult on the case? Or are you being hired to offer an opinion in the case? Are you going to go to mediation? You're going to be deposed? You're going to go to trial? And what's the fees for all of that? And what's the schedule for payment?
Mm-hmm.
Can't be too specific. Can't be too clear. And the bottom line is, once again, black letter law, 100%. Contracts that should not, you don't want your contract to need interpretation, which means you want it clear and unambiguous, which the case law says in a nutshell, doesn't need interpretation, can't handle interpretation, and won't withstand interpretation because there won't be a need for it. And so you want the lawyer who does it for you to run it by whoever he or she needs to run it by, to the point where you see any ambiguity?
Okay.
And what Judge Platt just said is brought to mind something. Maybe have two friends who are lawyers. Have the corporate lawyer who can help you with the drafting, and have the litigator who can say what she's seeing when she's representing clients with vague agreements in a courtroom. So I know that may require you to have two friends who are lawyers, which may be two more than you want. But I've never had a case when contract interpretation is an issue where the lawyer who drafted the contract is the lawyer defending the contract in my courtroom. It's like the Wizard of Oz, always blaming someone else who's not there. So I think that to have two sets of eyes, have the corporate eyes and have the litigator's eyes look at it.
Absolutely.
And what Judge Platt said is spot on. We're not going to create obligations that don't exist or vitiate obligations that do exist. We're looking at the words of the contract. The plain meaning of the contract says something, then that's what we're going to enforce. Again, absent fraud, duress, overreaching, and the like, which probably it's a high hurdle to overcome with sophisticated parties to the contract, and you all are very sophisticated.
And you could agree on anything if it isn't illegal or unethical, and it'll likely be enforced. So you can agree on all kinds of strange things that, and one of the arguments is, well, this shouldn't be enforceable. It's strange. And you go, or I had one, where I was, in effect, the argument was, well, this was fair in 2015, but it's not fair now. Answer, you see anything in the contract, you see the word fair?
Right.
You can agree to something unfair if you want. Okay, it's not advisable. But you want, there's plenty of, and as far as the lawyers taking responsibility for you, and, they won't, and you shouldn't take responsibility for them.
And that ties into, that your opinion does not guarantee a certain result. I'm certain that all of you already have that in your engagement letter, but as Judge Platt said, say it, make sure you say it, and make sure you say it, because if it's not in there, you may not have the luck with the judge saying, well, the parties didn't intend this.
Yeah, and you want as we, the standard operating procedure, but again, it's good to have a friend who's a lawyer. You want an integration clause, because if you don't want somebody to say, well, it isn't in the contract, but this is what we agreed on.
Right.
It's called an integration clause. It says anything, any conversations, any promises, anything that we did or talked about or agreed upon before we signed this contract is gone unless it's in here. And again, we being judges, we're not going to see it during the trial of the case you were hired in, unless somehow the other side got a hold of it and is using it to impeach you. Right. Well, where we will see it is if you start litigating with the lawyer or the client who hired you, and you may want to have everybody that's involved sign off on it. Okay. Again, that's your friend, your lawyer who's a friend, or lawyers who are friends, giving you advice not only on what it ought to say, but who ought to say it.
Two interesting things there. You've noted, kind of come back to it not being discoverable potentially, and that is interesting. It wouldn't be discoverable with any of the other documents that maybe you reviewed, or documents of your opinion, things like that. The engagement letter is not included in that.
I think the engagement letter probably is discoverable. That's interesting. I would think it would be, because it creates any basis for possible cross-examination or impeachment of the expert about any expectations, right. The money that's paid, the thoroughness of the expert. So having your engagement letter that the lawyer should be answering your calls and respecting your requests for information. Obviously not said like that. Have your lawyer friend look at that very concept. But yeah, what's in the? I do think the engagement letter is discoverable. I don't think Judge Platt said that.
Okay. As I'm sure Judge Driscoll had, we've heard those arguments. I mean, the likelihood is it is discoverable. That said, the argument against it would be a quote attorney work product or attorney experience, but it's not attorney work product. Okay. And I mean, you can make that argument, but it isn't. Right. The other thing is, and this is important, you want to guarantee something in there that gives you some degree of credibility under the theory that it is discoverable. You want to be able, so you don't get asked that classic question, well, if I told you A, B, C, and D, would that change your opinion? You want something in there that says you're going to get A, B, C, and D from the attorney who's hiring you, unless they don't have it. Okay. And because if you get asked that question, in order to maintain your credibility, if the answer is yes, you're going to have to say yes. Or we're not going to believe you. But so you want as much in there as possible to, in the sense that you want some, you're garbage in, garbage out, or garbage not in, garbage still out. You didn't know this, and you didn't know that, and you didn't get notice, and you didn't see that, and you didn't see this. It's devastating, especially if we saw it.
Something else that you brought up was talking about having everybody sign it. So I've gotten to where I'll have the attorney sign the agreement, but then as far as for payment for the fees, I have the client sign it as well. Do you guys have any thoughts that you're able to share on who signs, who's responsible, who the contract is with when we're engaged on a litigation assignment?
I like that idea, Janae, of the client signing it too. I think that creates a little bit of not quite insurance, but close enough to insurance that the lawyers read it and the lawyer's bound by those expectations. Now the client knows those are the expectations also. You may also want to have in there that each party to the agreement has acknowledges that they had the opportunity to consult with counsel before doing so. That's another little helpful thing. Again, have your friends who are lawyers though, so that you do have the opportunity to consult with counsel. But yeah, the more
Again,
folks
yeah,
finding it,
that,
the more people
I
are bound by
couldn't
it.
agree more. That it depends also on what you're being hired to do, for whom, and who's paying you. If the lawyer is going to pay you out of his or her own firm's money, then wouldn't be a big deal to have just them sign. But if the insurance company is that he or she has been hired by and ultimately will be paid by, regardless of who their client is going to be paying you. You want somebody from there saying they're going to pay you. Otherwise, when the lawyer says, I signed an agreement to pay him, you got to pay him. And they go, we didn't sign it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you signed to pay it, good luck, pay him. We didn't like the way this came out. Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm. Okay, great. Do you have any other thoughts? You mentioned having a clause in there for the attorney basically to provide or produce all the documentation, germane to my analysis. Make sure that you produce all of that to me. And I've had recently some interesting questions from retained attorneys come up, or some pushback on, frankly, an indemnification clause, and saying, well, if I sign this, then and something ever happens, that more or less puts me in a situation of having a conflict of interest because I have been engaged by this client to be their advocate. And then now you're kind of putting me in a position to also represent or be your advocate. And I could also see, I don't really know. Again, I'm not an attorney, so I'm behind the 8 ball, I feel like, in interpreting and crafting these things, and having attorney friends is necessary, or judges or people with expertise and wisdom. So are there areas, if an attorney goes ahead and signs something like an indemnification clause, or signs something where they say they're going to produce information to you, even if it is at to the detriment of their client, how does that play out in the courts, or for their their ethical responsibilities?
That's between the attorney and their client, because the attorney is a fiduciary vis-a-vis the client, has the obligation to put the client first. Simply signing to indemnify doesn't necessarily not put the client first. Not disclosing to the client might be problematic. I never want to say would be, but might be. Generally, the more is better. Just as Judge Platt said, with more is better in a contract, more is better in terms of an attorney's discussions with their client about any obligations they have, which might affect their ability to represent their client. But I don't see what you've described as a conflict, Janae. I don't see it as a conflict that cannot be reconciled with disclosure. To the extent it even is a conflict, I think the disclosure would overcome any conflict.
Yes, so I would totally agree with that in terms of disclosure. The only other thing I would say is whether it is or is not a real conflict. And I think it probably isn't. That said, it gives the opposing attorney something, what I'd call talking points, and it requires an explanation to a jury or even any fact finder of what does indemnification mean, because it sounds like it means something bad. And in other words, with you know what he just did? He just promised to pay her or him, the expert, if there's a problem with their opinion. Okay, so they were bought and sold. Now that's not true, but that's an argument and that's the argument that would be made if you were somewhat unscrupulous, which we know most lawyers are not, right?
For sure.
All right, excellent. Well, before we wrap up with final thoughts, I wanted to ask Michael Kaplan a question real quick. Michael, would you tell us what is the most significant or important change that you've made to your engagement letter template over the years?
I've made a number of changes over the years, and I've been doing this kind of work for nearly 50 years. And virtually all of my work is in the context of legal disputes. So I've got people who are geared up for litigation on one side of the case or the other. There are a few things that I want to be sure are covered in my retainer agreement. Number one, I want to be sure that I'm going to get paid. I want to maximize the likelihood that I'm going to be paid for my services. And doing that involves asking for an upfront retainer, a cash retainer that will be applied to the last bill in the case. That also includes explaining, being very, very clear as to when payment is due. Payment is due upon presentation of my invoice. And if a bill goes 30 days past due, services must be suspended. And if a bill is 45 days past due, I have the option to choose to withdraw from the case. And the case will be considered completed, even though a report has not been issued. I need to be very, very clear on payment of the bill. I mean, that's critical. So, I mean, I can't be in the case on a contingency fee basis. So I do everything I can in my retainer letter to make it clear that no part of my fee is contingent upon the outcome of the case.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Michael, that's very helpful.
The other part of it is that I want to minimize the possibility of being sued or the exposure, the liability that comes along with being sued. So I'm very, very clear as to, what I am, what my responsibilities are, what I've promised in this case, what my deliverable is. Now, when I say very, very clear, that doesn't mean have a specific list of work product, a specific list of reports and things that I'm going to address, because that only limits my ability to do my best work. I have seen a lot of retainer letters, a lot of engagement letters that have very, very specific language relating to there's going to be a valuation, and it's going to be considered a conclusion of value, or it's going to be considered a calculation of value, and this is what the report is going to be like, and this is what the opinion looks like. From my perspective, in my experience, that type of language is very, very limiting for the expert, because when we're brought into a legal dispute as an expert, often the nature of our involvement evolves and changes as the case evolves. And what happens is when it changes, do we want to be in a situation where we have to have a new engagement letter every time the attorney asks us to do something new, or every time we discover something more that needs to be done, or a turn or redirection of what we're doing? So we need to have enough flexibility. My typical engagement letter, it is an agreement where I have been retained to perform certain consulting services to counsel in this matter. Counsel will determine the scope of the work that we're doing. And, typically I do not get any more specific than that in describing the scope of the engagement. I just make sure that I have enough documented communication between myself and counsel so that there is no lack of understanding as to what I'm doing.
Excellent as always. I appreciate the thoughts that you guys have imparted to us today, as always, and I look forward to seeing you guys next month. Somebody else will be interviewing, but I will be watching and taking notes again.
Thank you, Janae. Thank you, Mike. And
Take care.
Just always a joy to listen to, and just a wealth of knowledge for us out here in the battlefield, if you will. So we're going to move to our next segment. We're going to bring Michael Gregory back to do his industry information, core body of knowledge. Michael, I can see your slides. We're good to go, and just need to put it in slide mode yeah, there you go. Welcome back, my friend. Good to have you back twice in a day. Oh, you're muted. There you go.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mel. And actually, you're stuck with me. I have one more time yet today. I'll be interviewing Mr. Merril Hirsh. So I have 3 times I'm up for today. With that in mind, though, I'm going to get started with industry headlines and industry updates. You know who I am. I'm on here each month, and I am involved with issue resolution related to mediation and negotiation on valuation issues nationally. Today we have 6 different articles I'm bringing up. The first is from Quick Read, adding success fees to starting the exit planning conversion. That could be an area for you. And even if you aren't doing it, it could be something that you might want to consider just to have that interaction with clients. Analytics on the structuring and pricing of preferred shares. I think most of us don't do preferred shares on a regular basis, but this European Business Valuation magazine presents some information on how to do that and what to consider. Hitchner's annual review of need to know BV topics. That's it out of BV Wire. Then we have Business Valuation Resources as a power panel offers insights into some recent issues. Disclose Me, AI tells appraisers, and that's kind of right on point with what's going to happen after today's session, and what to do about the dwindling real estate discount for lack of controlled database. And that's something with respect to FLPs we'll get into in just a moment here too. Main takeaways, assess adding succession fees, and it should be succession fees in exit planning. Note the impacts of preferred shares on startups. Note Hitchner's latest need to know. Assess the insights of the power panel to your practice. Choose to disclose AI and apply 5-year information to DLOCs from partnership profiles. So first of all, at the most recent NACVA CTI BVFLS that took place back in December, John Leonetti and Aaron O'Leary had a standing room only session where they talked about there's some changes that happened relative to the laws with respect to who can do what with respect to securities. And in this, the licensure change after 89 years, security licenses for business sale transactions are no longer required at the federal level. I don't know what happens at individual state levels, but at the federal level, they are not required. So what does that mean? That means that as an advisor, should you self-perform or partner for fee sharing? And this is not doing the appraisal. This is something completely different. This is working with someone else on what you're going to assist them with on exit planning, but not doing the valuation. And the risk return of self-performing business sale work is an area that might be something you have an interest in, have experience in, or would want to explore. And the quote here is, whether the owner decides to sell or simply wants to prepare for a future sale, your practice benefits. I'm, for example, helping something right now with a business that's probably going to sell for about $16 million. And I'm working with the owner and helping the owner figure out who they might want to bring on board to assist them in making the sale, because I've been involved with a number of those. So it's not exactly business valuation, but I'm involved with a fee that has nothing to do with valuation and something like this. You might want to think about this for yourself. Analytics on the structuring and pricing of preferred shares. And this is just a broad overview. It's a very detailed article. It's a lengthy article. But these are the major parts with respect to looking at preferred shares. The framework and characteristics of those, an overview of a host of different terms that you need to know, distribution of tiers mechanisms. So there can be different tiers of preferred and common stock, valuation framework, how we go about doing that. We're using the same similar types of techniques. What option pricing models, and there are additional ones that we don't normally consider, for example, looking at a discount, but rather option pricing models with respect to that particular entity. What methodologies and evaluation, there were 5 that were explored in this particular article on valuing preferred shares, and participating and non-participating shares, and there's more. This is just a broad overview if you're interested in getting a hold of that article. Hitchner's annual review of need to know BV topics. I subscribe to what Jim Hitchner has with Hardball with Hitchner. But this particular article is an updated cost of capital with a spectrum chart. It's a good visual. I've got a link to that. Multiple stage discounted cash flows, nothing new there, but we look at multiple stages of the cash flow and various levels of growth. New research on company growth with some additional information and some additional sources to think about. Plagiarism is a real bugaboo, and he suggests having footnotes in your report to make sure you're documenting that, because folks may take things out of your report and use it in their reports. Then upcoming ruling by SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, on the COLI valuation issues. This is something that's big in the insurance industry. It's not something we deal with directly, but it is interesting to have a valuation issue in front of the Supreme Court. And Hitchner's Mythbusters, Hardball with Hitchner publication. Again, I subscribe to that. It comes out once a month. Always has good insights. So this is just some comments from Jim Hitchner's with his annual review of need to know BV topics. BVR Power Panel. The folks involved are Ken Pia, Jeff Tarbell, Neil Beaton, and Michelle Geller. Those four people are very well known in our industry. Know what the other litigant is bringing to court. So if you're involved in a case with litigation, you need to know what they're bringing and the background of what they're bringing. Unreasonable comp. This is becoming more complex in terms of litigation. You're suggesting hiring someone who is a specialist in evaluation of reasonable compensation. They comment there's an upswing trend with mediation. I'm a mediator. I've done over 2,500 of them. I can tell you this is a real trend relative to both sides saying, instead of going to court, can someone come in to help us resolve this issue between us with valuation issues? And that's what I do 2 to 4 times a month in a typical month. Especially train younger staff on communication skills. Those used to be called the soft skills. They're now called the critical skills. So you want to make sure that the younger staff are being exposed to other things to enhance their skills. The use of control is not black and white. And the nice part about that part of this article is much of what's involved with control, either you think it may or may not be based on some percentage of stock, but there are a lot of elements of control, over 19 elements of control that might be involved in determining do you have control or don't have control. Disclose me, AI tells appraisers. It's a crucial role of verifying appraiser authorship. This is an article by Melanie Modica. You can see those are her credentials, and it's in ASA articles. Clearly disclose if you used AI for content generation. So for example, I use Grammarly. Grammarly has made me a better writer. I've written 12 books. I've been a contributor on 3 other books. I'm not the best writer in the world. I've had editors and senior editors and publishers make me sound good. But now with Grammarly, I use that because it makes me more concise with the language that I'm writing. And it comes in here and says, clearly disclose if you used AI for content generation. I didn't use it for content generation. I use it for editing purposes. Not advocating either way in this article to use AI or not, just that if you use AI for content generation, you need to disclose that. I did a critique of an appraiser's work recently, when they were talking about the economy. They had something that was in part generated by AI, and they took things that came out of some blogs. So there are some people who have a spin on what they want to say the federal government is doing right or not doing right. I told the guy, I think you need to go back and look at your report. Putting in facts on governmental statistics and interpreting those is fine. But be very careful, because AI introduced some blogs into your write-up on facts that aren't facts necessarily, but spin by certain authors. Need for professional standards and guidelines are out there, and they're not there yet. And then as an aside, a separate BV Wire survey found that 43% of respondents currently use AI for something. So it's definitely here. It's growing, and it should be a really interesting commentary in what shows up after today's session. So what to do about the dwindling real estate DLOC database? In January 2024, partnership profiles determined that there was an insufficient number of publicly registered partnerships and REITs for minority interests and discounts. So what do? They said, just consider using a 5-year average on the discounts. Consider income approach if possible. And the comprehensive guide for valuation of flips and LLCs by Bruce Johnson, James Park, and Spencer Jeffries. So be aware of that if you're using this source. Here's some additional resources. Here's Hitchner's link for cost of capital spectrum chart. The new research on company growth article I brought up, Hardball with Hitchner publication, 43% of survey respondents use AI. Comprehensive guide for the valuation of family limited partnerships and LLCs, and you can buy that. So that's my report for this week on this topic. That's my phone number. That's my email. If you have any questions or concerns, please come back to me. And at this, I'm going to pass this back to Chanda here for a few moments.
Hey, Mike, thank you for that. Just really quick, I do have the 5th polling question up, so please remember to respond to that to make sure you receive CP credit if you have a subscription with us. And I'm going to share my screen for a moment.
I'm trying to stop sharing mine, Chanda. I'm not getting the cursor there.
Got it. It's like I took over. So,
good. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Before we move on to the next segment with Michael Gregory and Merril Hirsh, wanted to go over some publications. We recently received some submissions about questions on where members or individuals can find these articles that Mike Gregory is highlighting during the Around the Valuation World webcast. So I just want to take a moment to show you where those are at on our website. So if you go to nacva.com, we do have a publications link at the very top. And that link actually has all the information about our articles. We have the association's news, which comes out once a quarter. And then the Value Examiner. With the Value Examiner, that is member benefits. So once you click on that, you will be prompted to log in to verify that you are a member, and then you'll be able to access all the articles there. We also have the Journal of Forensic and Investigative Accounting. The Quick Read is also there. And also, of course, the Around the Valuation World webcast and the International webcast, along with the European Business Valuation Magazine, which is a magazine that's published by our European chapter, the EACVA. And yeah, and so those are, and if you are interested in writing any articles for us or contributing any information, you're able to click on that call for authors, and we'd be excited to review your submissions to see which publication would be best fitted for the content that you would like to provide. So, yeah, and if you have any questions, please feel free to let us know. You can reach out to me in the chat. I'd be more than happy to help you with that a little further. But with that, I want to turn time back over to Mike Gregory so that we can proceed with his segments and his interview with Merril Hirsh. And Merril, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, John.
And Chinda, with that change, I am not able to move my PowerPoint forward. Are you able to move it forward on your end?
Yeah, I can share. Hold on one moment. Let me pull that back up because when I went to the website, it okay.
And everyone, there is a polling question right now, so make sure you respond to that.
All right, I am sharing my screen now.
Yeah, I'm not able to see the polling question or anything right now, Chinda, after you took over and it came back. So I'm just looking at the camera, but I've got the information on the PowerPoint slide in front of me on a piece of paper. So I'm looking at this and it says, what I have here, court appointed neutral special masters. What are they and why valuators and analysts should know more about them? We have an interview here with Merril Hirsh. I'll tell you, Merril Hirsh is a very interesting guy, very intelligent guy. He's got a lot to offer and some real strong insights. He's the executive director of the Academy of Court Appointed Neutrals. He's the principal at Hirsh ADR, PLLC, and the law offices of Merril Hirsh, PLLC. I started going over with him with his background. He's got such an interesting background. But he said, Mike, just tell them he's litigated for over 40 years and he has litigated in over 40 states. That says so much. And he started off his career as a trial attorney with the Department of Justice in the Civil Division. Today, he works as a complex commercial litigator, and he's from Washington, D.C. With that, let's go to the second slide, Chinda. And I'm going to say, is there anything else you want to add about your background, Merril?
Well, not really, except most of my time now is in alternative dispute resolution, as well as the work for ACAN that we'll talk about. But thank you also for inviting me. And I'm a little concerned about being called interesting. It's like being, may you be born in interesting times or something. But I appreciate it.
No, I'm very impressed. If you get a chance, you can, if you look him up on his sources here, a very professional, very substantial background. But in terms of what do you do now and why do you do what you do now?
Well, I mean, the part that's most relevant, I'm a hearing examiner, I'm an arbitrator, I'm a mediator, but I'm also the executive director of the Academy of Court-Appointed Neutrals. It's the professional organization of what most people call special masters, but we're trying to change that.
And why are you concerned about that? What's the difference, neutral or special master? Why do you indicate there's a concern with respect to those terms?
All right. Well, let's start with what in the world is a court-appointed neutral for a second, because that'll help explain why we think it's a much better name for it. A court-appointed neutral is really a Swiss Army knife. It's somebody appointed by a court to assist in some way. The most common traditional way that lawyers think about this might be the judge who's pulling his or her hair out in frustration at the party because they're fighting over discovery, and they said, and the judge says, I want to send you to your mother. I mean, a court-appointed neutral, somebody to handle this stuff because I'm sick of you folks. But it can be any number of other things. It can be someone appointed by a court to be a monitor, to make sure a decree gets implemented, or to allocate a fund and figure out who gets what from it, or to provide expertise to the court that will help the court understand it or help the court figure out which expert is giving junk science or whether they both are, or to operate as in forensic capacity to figure out where money went, or obviously for NACFA members to help value companies, or to help mediate aspects of dispute over valuation, or perhaps inform the parties as to where the valuation might go, which might assist them in figuring out how to settle it. Basically, anything you want to appoint some neutral to assist the court process, that's what it is. Now, why does the name matter? The most common name for this, not the only one, there are jillions of them, is master or special master. Obviously, the term master, carries with it an enormous bit of baggage. But although it has both positive and negative connotations, the negative connotations are really awful. But even the positive connotations that suggest it's someone brought in to take over. I'm the master, you're responding to me. And the problem is the job is someone brought in to help. And so it's led to enormous confusion about what this role is. It leads people to be understandably scared about what's going to happen, concerned that they may be asked to pay for it, worried about what authority is delegated. And if you think of this as a court-appointed neutral, a neutral appointed by the court in any number of capacities, you start realizing that this is something to help the process, not something to make it worse.
You brought up a number of different terms here, and I want you can just take a moment for our audience. What's an arbitrator? What's a mediator? And then what's this neutral? What's the difference? Explain what these are, please.
All right. An arbitrator is someone hired privately by parties to adjudicate a dispute. There are statutes that provide for how arbitration works, but there needs to be an agreement of some sort between the parties that rather than have our dispute decided in a court, we're going to hire someone to decide it, with the main advantages of that process being that if it's done well, it can be way cheaper and the parties can tailor the proceeding, and it doesn't necessarily have to have the formality of a court proceeding, and it doesn't necessarily need to be public in the way a court proceeding would do. And so if it's done well, it can be a lot faster. A mediator, a mediation, is someone who is brought into the process to assist the parties in discussing how they might resolve something. People think of it as assisting in settling an entire dispute, but it doesn't have to be. Mainly, it's someone who assists the parties speaking to each other. A mediator doesn't make things or decide the case or make any binding determination. It's rather a facilitator of discussion to help the parties understand what their interests are, figure out where common ground might be. A court-appointed neutral is a role that might well use some of the same skills. So it helps you if you can help parties work something out. Appointed by the court for a purpose set forth in an order designed by the court, and it's not a purely private process. A court-appointed neutral is a judicial officer, someone appointed for purposes by the court under rules that the court follows.
So if I summarize this, see if I'm listening well, the arbitrator is someone who can make the decision. the mediator is an impartial person where the parties make the decision and the mediator facilitates that process. And in a neutral, you're appointed by the court. So you have authority of the court, but you're brought in to work with the parties to resolve that issue. Am I getting that right?
It could be. I mean, it's the last part. That's certainly one function. It could be that the neutral is brought in by the court to help decide the issue. So it could be an adjudicative capacity. It could be a facilitative capacity where the neutral isn't brought in to decide anything. It could be an informative capacity. The neutral is brought in to advise from some area of expertise. And it can be valuation and analysis, or, but it could also be someone who's an expert in database management to help, manage the information that the parties are exchanging, or somebody who's an expert in cybersecurity, or any number of different fields that could assist the litigation. A forensic accountant to figure out where money went from the trust. It could also be investigative, where the person's charged with going out and doing a report on something that the person found. It could also serve as a liaison, somebody who the parties may be discussing settlement on their own, and they need to convey a message to the court that if you just decide this one issue would really help us, understand where we are and resolve the case. And it's awkward for the parties to have a direct communication with the court. The court doesn't need to know and doesn't want to know what they're discussing about settlement. So
what I hear you saying then, Merril, is being appointed by the courts and neutral could be very broad. And then we're gonna focus on NACFA members. We're gonna focus on people who are valuers now. So they could be brought in to do an analysis. They could be brought in to actually make a recommendation to the court. They could be there to actually be the decider. Court says, I want you to decide and let me know. You've got a wide variety of what it could be. Depends on what that court wants for this given valuer to assist. Could be analysis, could be give me a value number, could be a number of things that are permeations of those. Am I getting it right now, do you think?
Yeah, you're getting it right. The role would vary by the court. The only slight tweak I would make is, unless the parties agree, they're not likely to be appointed to make a final decision. They may be appointed to do a recommendation for the court's final decision, or enter an order that's subject to review of the court. But everything else you said was spot on.
Okay. Well, now, how do you become one of these neutrals? How does that work? It seems like if the judge knows you, or the judge has had experience with others, you're in good shape. If you haven't done this before, how do you become one of these neutrals?
That's a great question. And by saying it's a great question, that's a lousy answer. But here's the story. The traditional way that people have gotten appointed to these things is to know a judge. And it's still true that that's helpful. Part of what my organization, the Academy of Court-Appointed Neutrals, is doing is to create new pathways into the profession that haven't existed before. And the difficulty of explaining it is I can explain what we're attempting to do, but to say, well, this is proven to work when you haven't done it before is an impossibility. But part of what we're trying to do is encourage courts, for example, to set up rosters so that people can be vetted. There are a lot of advantages to having rosters. One thing is, if the judge is going to pick someone they know, it almost guarantees it's a repeat player. Or if the judge is going to say, parties, who would you like to appoint? That also pretty much guarantees it's a repeat player. And how do you broaden the profession? By bringing new people in who might bring more diversity in every sense understood, not just demographic diversity, but skill sets, geographic experience in different industries, whatever. And so we encourage people to set up rosters. We also encourage people, when parties are selecting people like judges, rather than have a judge say, look, I want you folks to talk and suggest somebody to me, we have encouraged as a best practice for the judge to say, I want each of you to come back with lists that include a diverse group of candidates that meet what it's called the Ray corollary of having, it's like what the NFL, sort of implement of having broad representation, but also come back and tell me where you went, so that we can make sure you haven't just said, well, I know this guy, we'll just use this guy again. So you can broaden it. we're also doing a lot of changes nationally in how this is understood and how it's used in a significant way that people can get involved in the profession is by getting involved in those changes. So the commercial court in Indiana, for example, is this week announcing that they've adopted a new rule on court-appointed neutrals, and they're going to work under this new rule. So if you again are in Indiana, getting involved with the commercial court in Indiana, if they're doing rosters or they're doing other work on it, is a way to get in on the ground floor. This is part of what we have done is work on model rules that can be implemented. So get involved in doing this in your state, and you're part of the process for doing. So that's a long answer, but I hope it's helpful.
That was a very detailed, but a very good answer. Now I'm going to move to it's a second last slide here, Chinda. Trying to click on my own here. This is the item of what are the levels of membership in your organization, and how do these three different levels work, and what happens after you become a member?
Okay, cool. We have three levels of membership. We have a fellow. Fellow is a category for people who have experience in this, and we have minimum levels of having done this previously, and you know, in X number of occasions, or demonstrate that level of proficiency in some other way. Basically, there's a description on the website. A member is a category we created when ACAN decided to broaden its approach to try to bring new people into the profession. So it doesn't require that anyone had ever done this before. It does require in both of these things that you agree to adhere to standards that we're setting for the profession. And members are for people who are interested in becoming a neutral but have not necessarily done it before. And then associate are for people who don't necessarily want to become but are interested in the profession. It's a way of dealing with situations where maybe judges are interested, but they don't really want to say, I'm a member of an organization of groups, but they're interested and want to get our emails and information on it, or, you know, and other people of that.
The lowest level might be for a judge or someone who's interested in what you're doing. The second level might be somebody who's interested in being a neutral. They haven't done it before. The third level might be someone who already has done this before, has experience. And those would be the three different levels. Am I getting that right?
That's exactly right. You've got it. And on the slide are links. If you go to our website, you'll be able to see it. The main website is www.courtappointedneutrals.org. And there's a membership thing. It has information on how to join. And we're working with NACVA. We encourage people to do this because you have a great skill set for doing this type of profession. And then what happens after you become a member, which is the other part of your question, we try to give our members a lot of value in a lot of ways. One of the things you do as a member is to do a profile on our website. So our website becomes the most sophisticated roster and the easiest place for people to locate people who do this. As I've said, we've encouraged people to we have an RFP process. I haven't said this, but we have an RFP process so people can do it. We send it out to our members. We have we try to promote our members. So people send us things they're doing, articles, awards, whatever, and we will post that on our LinkedIn site, and our members repost it, so you get connected with a broad community. A lot of information, of some of which is public, but some of which is behind the member wall. We have a terrific annual meeting and a lot of other things. So, you know, we think it's a great opportunity for anyone who wants to take their skills and either work with a neutral or become.
Well, Merril, thank you very much. We'll go to the last slide now, Chinda. And there's the contact for Merril. There's also his phone number. That's his website. He's done a very nice job of sharing with us how this works. I want to thank you very much for being here, Merril. This is very interesting for me, very interesting for all of us. And with that, I'm going to say thank you and then pass it back to Chinda here for closing out, or is it Mel or Elena?
Thank you so much, Mike. Great to speak with you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Merril. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this month in this show. Remember that after we finish this show, we have another another presentation that it's AVMs and AI tools. Be careful. And we are going to see you all next month on May 20th with